Welcome to the Divorce Podcast, a podcast that aims to address divorce, separation and co-parenting here in the UK, countering the often sensationalist way it's portrayed in the media, challenging the status quo and driving for reform. On each episode, I'm joined by experts to discuss divorce, separation and co-parenting from different angles and to give their opinions and to debate them. I'm Kate Daly, a relationship counsellor and divorce coach, co-founder of Amicable, the divorce services company, and host of the Divorce Podcast. In this episode, I was joined by Anthony Syder to discuss how to keep the cost of divorce low. Anthony is a divorce specialist at Amicable and has worked in the area of divorce, mediation and family dispute resolution for the past 8 years. His areas of interest include the voice of the child and diverse and inclusive families. We begin this episode by looking at Anthony's tips around keeping the legal costs down whilst you divorce, including how much of the legal process you can do yourself and the options available to you when it comes to choosing professional help. We look at some factors that impact the fairness of financial settlements, particularly given the current cost of living crisis, and what fluctuating asset valuations, such as pensions, mean in terms of your financial agreements. Finally, we look at practical things to consider as you make arrangements for your children, such as the rising cost of childcare and how child maintenance works. This is a great episode if you're looking for ways to keep the cost of divorce low during the current cost of living crisis. If you really loved this episode or want to hear more episodes like this, then please make sure to rate us on your preferred listening platform. Enjoy the episode. Welcome, Anthony.
Hi, Kate.
Thanks for joining us, Anthony. It's great that we can have a chat today about keeping the cost of divorce low. We seem to be, or we are, in a cost of living crisis, as everybody knows, and that has particular sort of fears and concerns for people when they're changing their family structure and going from being parents to co-parents and when they're divorcing and separating. So really the focus today is to give some hints and tips on how to keep the cost of divorce low and just looking a bit more broadly at some of the wider impacts of the cost of living crisis. So I know we both work our caseloads at Amicable and we have lots of experience of dealing with people right now who are worried about the cost of divorcing. So let's start by some top tips on how you can keep the cost of divorce and separation as low as possible.
Yeah, of course. There's a few really good tips to try and keep the cost of divorce low. I think one of the best tips is that there is the option of being able to do the divorce yourself on the government website. So that's something that many people are looking into, particularly with the recent law changes that came in earlier this year. And it means that the only fee that is payable is the court fee, if that's something that's relevant to you. There's also the Help with Fees scheme, which means that for people who are on a lower income or are supported by benefits, they're able to apply for the Help with Fees to possibly remove that court fee altogether, or at least part of it as well if they're eligible. So those are two of some of the more direct impacts on the divorce side of things. But in general, there are lots of ways of keeping the cost of your divorce low. And one of those main tips is to be amicable, because if people are able to work together in the process and to talk about these things, it makes working through the process easier, quicker, more efficient, and a lot more cost effective as well.
Brilliant. Well, we'll come on to that, but let's just clarify a couple of things on that government portal. So it's become easier to use because you don't have to apportion blame anymore. So now there are no grounds for divorce. It's much more of a simple and straightforward administrative process. Is it easy enough for people to use? Can most people do it without any help?
Yeah, I think for most people that are comfortable using technology, I often say to people when I'm speaking with them over the phone about that as an option, that if you can manage to do your banking online, you can probably manage to do your divorce online as well. Generally, it's a pretty easy portal to follow. And like you say, it's not as many details or sort of intrusive questions anymore. It's more just some of those personal details, uploading your marriage certificate, and it is fairly straightforward and manageable for most people.
And so now you make the application, and the only real decision I guess you've got at the beginning of the process is whether you want to make a sole or a joint application. But then you go into this 20-week reflection period where nothing really happens. But what happens after that? So does it continue to be easy to use that portal?
Yeah, so you get prompts from the portal at the end of that 20-week period when it's time to log in and move to the next step, which is to apply for your conditional order. And then they keep you updated as well with the correspondence on that conditional order when you can expect that, and the same process again about 6 weeks later when it's time to apply for your final order as well. So it's pretty straightforward for the divorce itself. And of course, the financial aspect of that is a separate legal process that goes hand in hand, but that's separate to the divorce.
So that's the bit where people like Amicable or other routes, traditional solicitors or mediators, can really add some value then, isn't it, in the finances? But the administrative side of things, I mean, I still have people ring up and say they've been charged several £1,000s from a solicitor to do that very basic divorce application. And what we're saying is there really is no need to spend huge amounts of money on that part of the process. And I was just interested in what you said before as well, Anthony, that you can even get that potentially for free if you're on a very low income. And that's not the same as having legal aid, is it? Because there is no legal aid or very little legal aid now in divorce cases. But that's something different. You called it help with fees?
Yeah, exactly. So it's help with fees. It's a separate scheme to the legal aid scheme. And sometimes people feel that they wouldn't be eligible for it because they've been told previously that they're not entitled to legal aid. So really important, as you say, to stress that it is a separate process. And it's based on income. And again, that's fairly easy to follow as well. You can apply for that on the government website too. I believe that the main pieces of information that they need for that application is your national insurance number, as well as some of your personal details and your income as well.
Brilliant. But if you feel you do need some help with the administrative side of divorce, we obviously offer a very low cost fixed price for doing a divorce, and there will be other people who will offer much lower cost. So it's worth shopping around, isn't it, in terms of finding the balance between a really good service and a low cost service, where you can get some help with doing that divorce if you feel that going onto the government website yourself is a step too far.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's just about being aware of what your options are. Of course, everything has a value to it. So some people will value not having to manage any part of that court process or to worry about that. And so it may be more beneficial for them on balance to use someone like Amicable or others who would be able to manage that for them. So it's about understanding what your options are, doing a little bit of research and considering what has the most value for you and what the best option is.
Sure. So the other thing you came onto then, we started to talk, didn't we, about trying to stay amicable, and that really, I guess, is the biggest decider in how long, how complicated, and how expensive your divorce is going to be. So how can you get things onto a better footing, if you're still in the throes of a relationship breakdown and the turmoil that brings? How do you be amicable under those circumstances?
Yeah, and it's not to say that being amicable is easy. It's still challenging. There's still difficult conversations, as you rightly say. I think one of the biggest tips is not to try and rush those conversations. It's one of the benefits, actually, of having that 20-week reflection period now, is that people are, in a way, they're forced to take the time to consider what the best outcome is and what the best way forward for everyone on balance is. So yes, early on in that separation, it may be really difficult to have those conversations, but give it a bit of time, give it a bit of space, and see what you can discuss and agree between the two of yourselves to start with. And then for the parts of the conversation where you need a bit more assistance, either with the details or actually just in the conversation itself, it's worthwhile again looking into the options, which isn't necessarily for both of you to engage independent solicitors. For some people, that may be the only way forward, but there are really good alternatives to that, like, as you say, using mediation or using a divorce specialist through a company such as Amicable, who can work with you both and assist you both in understanding your options and actually just in having that conversation as well. But all that you can do together right the way through is what makes a good process, a quick process, and a cheaper process as well.
I think from experience, the difficulty with that is there's usually one of you who's in quite a different place. So if you're the instigator, you've probably been thinking about this for a while, haven't you? You've kind of come to terms with it in your mind. So you're at the point where you want to push the button, get on with things. You've done your emotional grieving. You're ready to start thinking of solutions. But if your partner, has only just started to really hear and understand that news that, the marriage is over from your perspective, they're in a much rawer state, aren't they? And it's much more difficult for them to be in that solution-focused mode. So giving the partner a bit more time to come to terms with what has happened gives you a much better opportunity to bring your best selves to the negotiation, because ultimately that's what this is all about, isn't it? It's how you get an effective negotiation so that you can look after children and your best interests as a family. So I guess that breathing space, accepting and understanding that you might be in very different places, rather than just feeling the frustration that your ex isn't quite where you are in all of this, is kind of absolutely key to really thinking through how you can stay amicable.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really important point, because particularly when you're trying to reach an agreement together, you can't get to the finish line without the other person. And it may be, as you say, a little bit frustrating at the beginning that one person is really wanting to push ahead and the other person's not quite there. But giving them a bit of space, giving them, a few weeks or a month may mean that you can still stay on that amicable path, rather than if you try and push it a bit too far and it really falls over and you have to engage solicitors, the process ends up being a whole lot longer than if you gave a bit of space at the beginning to begin with. Particularly, as you say, when there are children involved, what both of you want and what your children need are for the two of you to be okay. So we need to make sure that even though it's not the most comfortable process all the time and that there are challenging conversations, it's in everyone's interest, and it's far too important to not be fully engaged in, because the ongoing implications of whatever outcome you reach will impact both of you and your children going forward. So it requires a certain level of care, of course, a necessary amount of time to make sure that it is the best possible solution for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. When you were just talking then and you were saying that, you've got to get to the finishing line together, I had this image of like a 3-legged race in my head. And you know what it's like? You remember that when you were a kid, and if you were the slightly faster one, you were trying to like run quicker than your partner could go, you just end up in a big sort of heap on the ground. And you need to be in step, don't you? And getting in step emotionally is quite tricky, and it does require, some thought and some attention, as you say. And I think, what you just said then was really important about you have to engage and you have to give it some proper headspace. You sort of can't fit a divorce around your normal everyday life. You have to give it some time. And I think if you can, and I know it's so hard to ask for more time from people, isn't it? But if you can just create some headspace and maybe let some of the other stuff go to create that headspace, I think you do stand a better chance of creating a path to being more amicable. And as you say, it pays dividends, because I always think that animosity is the gift that keeps on giving. It just comes back at you year in, year out, and there'll be some other, everything will calm down, and then there'll be another sort of thing that rears its head in a couple of years' time. And then if you haven't had that, amicable experience, and you haven't been able to create those together, not together skills, it just sends you right back to, the beginning of, and brings everything back to where you were when you were in the sort of heat of the moment. So I always think it's a process, a learning process, and it's an investment of your time and your skill set and your energy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I often say, well, when I say often, I say to almost every single set of customers that I work with, that my role is to part of my role is to try and make sure that we're getting the balance right between feeling as though it's productive and that we are moving through the process, but not feeling as though it's a process that's happening to you, not feeling as though you're being pushed or rushed through as well. And I think that's a really important aspect, because you need to try and put yourself in the other person's shoes. Usually within any relationship, there will be different roles that you've taken on. And for the person who hasn't necessarily been so involved in the financial aspect of your relationship, you've got to give them time to learn and to become informed and to become aware of what's going to work best moving forward, because it's probably something that they're incredibly anxious about and incredibly frightened of. And it goes the other way around other aspects. If it's someone who is thinking about moving out of the matrimonial home, they've probably got concerns and fears about the change that's going to be with their childcare arrangements. So it's trying to think of it from each other's perspectives as well, and just being a bit aware and kind to each other as well as yourself.
Mm-hmm. Well, fear's the real bad guy in all of this, isn't it? Because, it strikes me that a lot of people, if they could be their best confident selves, would have many more opportunities to come up with really creative and wonderful solutions for their families. But sometimes it's fear that holds people back, and fear that drives people towards, sometimes quite aggressive solicitor versus solicitor negotiations, because they want the protection and don't feel they can do it themselves. But what we see in the work that we do is when we can empower people, we create a much longer term solution, because at some point solicitors step away. And if that might be when you get your decree absolute or when the final settlement has been done, whatever it is, all of a sudden you're on your own. And then if things aren't panning out as you imagine, or there are different costs, or what it's like if you've got kids, you make the best arrangements in the world, but the next term something's different and everything's up in the air again. If you don't have those skills to be able to re-engage with your partner because you've outsourced that engagement to a solicitor, it makes it flipping hard to to come back and to carry on.
Absolutely,
doesn't it?
absolutely. And it's another reason why people should use that 20-week reflection period to their advantage. That's a perfect opportunity for the two of you to start trying something different, even if it's just an interim arrangement, even if it's different to what the end result is going to be, but to start working towards that financial independence, trying out different forms of how we're going to pay for the expenses for the children. Is it going to be a maintenance arrangement? Are we going to continue using a joint account? Trial and error. If you think about everything that you need to change and work through, it's very hard to get 100% of that right the first time. So it's the perfect opportunity to have an open dialogue, to talk through different ideas, to see what works. And that's different for different families, of course. And it's part of what we're there to try and support as well, because no one knows what the future holds. It's always going to be, to an extent, a form of crystal ball gazing. I mean, we've seen that in the last few months. There's people that we're working with who are very close to reaching an agreement, and all of a sudden they can't get that mortgage. What we're trying to do is find a solution that is one that will stand up as much as possible. And now nothing's going to be absolutely foolproof, but there is a reason why you have to wait the 20 weeks. It's not designed to be a quick process. It's too important to be a quick process that's rushed through.
But you're right, we are seeing quite a lot of people with concerns right now, aren't we? Do you think that's putting people off starting their divorces, and should they be put off? Are we suggesting people should wait, or what do you think with the current financial climate is the best advice for people?
I don't think that it's necessarily putting people off. I think it's making people stop and think about whether it is the right time. Like I say, we're always sort of crystal ball gazing to an extent, and I think it's not a question that I can answer in terms of whether they should wait, because that's just the thing. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know if in 6 months or 12 months' time things are going to get better or worse, whether people's incomes are going to increase or decrease, or what the change may be. We can only work on what the circumstances are now. And a lot of the time, when people are considering whether or not to start this process, it's not usually something that's driven by finances. Obviously, finances are an incredibly important aspect of that, but it's not usually the reason why people are thinking about starting it in the first place. So it's something that we can help people move through. But usually I think that people know within themselves whether now's the time to start, even if there are difficulties.
Yeah, I would say it's like having a baby. There's never a right time, is there? When everyone's trying to plan and make things perfect. Life doesn't work like that, does it? Sometimes you're faced with, maybe it's not even your decision, you're faced with having to do something. at this time. So it's really interesting what you say about, just trying to navigate what we've got right now in front of us.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing to add with that is, starting your divorce process doesn't mean that there is a time limit on when you're going to reach that financial agreement. People can take as much time as they need to sort of work through those options and talk that through. And you sit your divorce at that conditional order stage until you've reached those agreements anyway. So it's more about getting the ball rolling rather than thinking about it as setting a deadline on when everything needs to be all, finalized, because that's not the way around that it works in reality.
So just to clarify for people then, you don't have to do the divorce and the finances at the same time. It is possible to start the divorce and even complete it and then do finances separately. But there are some downsides to going all the way through the divorce, aren't there, before you do your finances? So I think what you're saying is get to the conditional order stage so that you're ready. You have to be at the conditional order stage in order to ask the court to look at your finances. So get to the point where you are as ready as you can be, but don't finalise the divorce until you've got some kind of agreement in place.
Yeah, that's right. So it may take you longer than the 20 weeks to reach your financial agreement, but that doesn't mean that at the end of that 20 weeks you need to absolutely be ready to sign on the dotted line or anything like that. Take as much time as you need. Generally, what we always recommend is that when people are starting the divorce process, it's perfect time to be having those financial conversations, because as you start to, live independently and become financially separate, it can make it a little bit more difficult to reach an agreement around finances if you begin that conversation in the future. That's not to say that everything needs to happen now, though, as part of that agreement. For example, it's not unusual for people to continue to, own a property together for a certain period of time if that's what they need to do for their children. That's still an agreement that you can reach now, even though the outcome of that doesn't take place until a certain period of time into the future.
Yeah, so that's really important, isn't it? Because you're talking about trying to make the agreements, but you don't have to necessarily execute them right now. So you might make agreements, as you say, and then delay the outcome of those agreements, particularly when you've got kids. And like you say, I think it's called a measure order, isn't it? When you agree not to sell the property till usually the youngest child's finished full-time secondary education. So there are ways of delaying. Does that make it more complicated?
Not always. I think most people in an ideal world would like to be able to do everything at the same time and have everything sorted. But I think the reality is that, financial independence generally for most couples can't happen at the click of your fingers. It is something that needs to be worked towards, and there may need to be an interim arrangement. The way that I often describe it to people is that what we need to understand is what the agreement is, and that can be a combination of here's what we've already done, here's what we're going to do now, and here's what we're going to do in the future. As long as there's agreement on what that is and when it's taking place, that's what's most important.
And I think one of the things that, we were talking about this before, one of the things that we are seeing at the moment is that the values of either properties or pensions in particular, stocks and shares, those sorts of things, because of what we're going through or we have been through in the last few weeks and months, there are some quite wild fluctuations at the moment, up and down, aren't there, for various assets. How do you deal with that in this kind of process?
It's a good question. It's not the easiest, and the way that I think it's best described is that quite often that's what's known as your financial disclosure. So when you're exchanging information with each other around what the finances are, obviously 20 weeks is a long amount of time, as we've seen in recent months, what that's looked like in terms of mortgage rates and also prime ministers. But essentially what we need to do within that 20 weeks is make sure that the dialogue is still open and that you're still communicating. So financial disclosure is an ongoing responsibility of both people in that process, so that if there are any significant changes, we're communicating what those changes are. And we're being very upfront with each other if we think that's going to impact what options are achievable and importantly, affordable as well. So it needs to be accurate and workable at the end point where we're ready to sign and submit it to the court. And that may mean that if something happens, that some of those conversations need to go back to the drawing board and work through different options. And we've been seeing a bit of that at the moment.
I guess that's where this whole business of how you do it and the relationship that you've got during the process is so important, isn't it? Because if you've battled it out, with two solicitors to get a disclosure that everyone's agreed upon, and that's kind of the end point, and then things change, it's really hard to go back, isn't it? And say, well, look, reasonably speaking, the pension's dropped by 20%, therefore if we're offsetting, we need to factor that in and all of this kind of stuff. But if you've been through a process where you're creating the open dialogue and you're both hearing all of the information all of the time, so there isn't a he said, she said, or my solicitor says this, no, my solicitor says that. If you eradicate that element of it, it strikes me that there's a much higher chance of remaining amicable and being able to navigate these big jumps and changes in valuations and the value of either property or, the cost of a mortgage or whatever. It feels like there is a much bigger opportunity to keep working through some of that adversity rather than just say, right, well, the deal's off and everybody huff back into their own corners.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that that's probably one of the most obvious points of difference, is that when people are working together and they're able to have those conversations and they're communicating that information, and there's a really good level of trust and good faith that everyone's being accurate with that information, that if someone says, hey, look, there's been a change and this deal's not going to work, that they're saying that from a practical perspective, not from a negotiation perspective. They're not haggling. It's not haggling over the price of a used car. It's about saying, look, the circumstances have changed. It's not your fault. It's not my fault. But that isn't a practical option, either from a achievable point of view. So, for example, I just can't physically get that mortgage anymore, or from an affordability point of view. Yes, I can still get that mortgage, but actually, because everything else has gone up in price, I wouldn't be able to continue to pay it with the rest of the agreement. So it's about being really open with each other. And again, doing that in good faith, and doing that in good faith doesn't mean that you can't renegotiate things if you need to. It's just about what's driving you to do that, and the circumstances are usually what's driving that at the moment.
Yeah, and I guess as well, there's this whole idea of if you can stay open-minded and you can sort of weather that kind of, or tolerate rather than weather, if you can tolerate the fact that the agreement is living and breathing and it's not done until it's submitted to the court, and even then, when you submitted it to the court, there could still be a change in your sort of valuations and figures between submitting it to the court agreeing it, and then it being executed. I think if you've got to keep, and if you can keep and tolerate that sense of ambiguity rather than get absolutely fixated on a percentage or a number, that helps, doesn't it? Because ultimately what you're looking for is family solutions. A solution to the fact that you are still a family, but you're now operating out of two homes, and therefore your cost base is completely different. But you're still a family and you still are working in the best interests of the family. And I think if you can tolerate some of that ambiguity, it definitely helps. It's more of an attitude rather than a have we got a deal? Is it definitely X or Y percentage?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's particularly the case where there are children involved, a conversation that, even prior to when we were really actively seeing the impacts of the cost of living crisis, it's a perfectly standard thing for us to talk about in terms of child maintenance, for example. If you're separating at this point, you've got a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, you're not expected to make a plan and talk about figures that are going to work to cover all expenses relating to that child right through until they're 18. That would be ridiculous. But what we are trying to do is reach an agreement around what are our circumstances now, what's the best way to do things, and then having a conversation about when are we going to review this and how are we going to review this? What are the things that we're going to look at on a yearly basis or each school term, whatever that may be, to make these decisions and make these conversations in future easier. Because like you say, at some point, the professionals step away. You've still got to be able to have those conversations on an ongoing basis as parents.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so important that it's about the relationship and how you do the review and how you're going to take each other's circumstances into account, because we have an awful maintenance trap at the moment, don't we, where the costs are rising. So if you're the receiving parent, your outgoings are rising exponentially. So you're looking to your partner, the paying parent, to perhaps meet some of those costs and to increase, the amount that they had originally agreed to pay. But then as the paying parent, your salary probably isn't going up, and certainly not. There aren't very many people who've had an inflation-proof pay rise this year. So you are being squeezed as well. And there is no right and wrong in that. Yes, parent A needs more. And yes, parent B can't afford to pay more. So it isn't that there's a right and a wrong and you just need someone to tell you who's right and who's wrong, which we often get asked to do, don't we, Anthony? But it's more about trying to look at how you can navigate that situation and where some savings could be made, because it's not just a question of, I need more, therefore please give me more. It's not possible for lots of people.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why we always say that the child maintenance calculator, that's a good starting point, but that's not the extent of the conversation. The conversation is a much wider one, and it's about saying, what is it that our child or our children need? And as their parents, how can we provide that to them? And being really realistic about that, as you say, if you can't afford all of these co-curricular activities, again, it's not either of your fault. You're both doing whatever you can to provide, but sometimes the numbers just don't add up. So it's about being able to have a conversation and say, well, we're going to need to make some adjustments here, and talking through what those options are and trying to find a solution. But there isn't always, like you say, an easy answer of, well, actually just give me more money, that quite often more and more at the moment just isn't feasible.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people are surprised that although there technically is a formula for child maintenance, it's only the very basic child maintenance there's a formula for, and that doesn't replace, as you say, all of the other things as parents you might want to do for your children that you're then going to have to agree. So I think sometimes, people say they want everything formulated so there isn't any room for having arguments or whatever. That's just really restrictive, isn't it? It doesn't take into account your individual family. And the beauty of choosing a process where you can both come together and work as a couple is that you can really bespoke the process to your individual family needs. And that's so important when things are so tight like they are now. And if you're going to be two single parents, it's a scary prospect going into this winter, being a single parent and worrying about how you're going to make it cope. So you do still need to be able to work together to try and take the edge off some of that for your kids, because when you work together, the possibilities are much greater than when you're battling as an individual.
Yeah, and it's worthwhile looking into what your options are. So because of the change in circumstances, and as you say, because you're going through the separation process and you're becoming two single parents, there may be different support options available to you, different benefits that are available. So there's lots of really good resources online. The Gingerbread website's always a really good one for advice and resources for single parents as well. Lots of really good information on there. So it's about scoping out everything that's available and looking into your circumstances and trying to do that together, because you're both wanting what is best for your children, and of course you're both wanting your child to and your children to have access to all of the opportunities that there are. So it's helping each other in that process as well, because you're still a team.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really sign up to this idea that you're a family, but you've got effectively two households to run now. And so whatever you can do to support the other parent's household has got to be a good thing, because ultimately your kids are benefiting from that. I mean, there are lots of different ways you can sort out children arrangements. We obviously have the Amicable Co-Parenting app, which helps organise co-parenting schedules. So when each child spends time with each parent, and it's a place where you can put all of your communication about your children, so you don't have to, flick through your WhatsApp messages endlessly to find the one thing that you basically thought you'd agreed 3 weeks ago or what have you. So those sorts of things work. What other things work in terms of keeping costs low for agreeing children arrangements?
I think having a regular period of review for the agreement is really useful. So that depends on how comfortable the two of you are around discussing finances. So for some people, they're happy to do that on an ad hoc basis, once every couple of weeks or as something pops up. Other people want to have something in the diary, so trying to do it at least once a school term or a couple of times a year in case, considering that there may be a significant change in circumstances, which may mean that you need to have a more urgent conversation around that. But trying to keep the cost of childcare, for example, low, rethinking how your childcare arrangements work. So if you currently use a breakfast club or an after-school club, are there options available? Is the other parent able to, even if it's not for an overnight, but it's just to, look after them for a few hours after school until you're finished with work? Again, it benefits everyone. So don't get too caught up on the time being spent with the children and who's got what overnights. It's about, isn't it a positive experience if they are able to have more time with that other parent anyway? And if you can save a bit of money while doing so, then that's great too. And of course, looking at if you're fortunate enough to be in a position where you've got a wider family support network that might be able to assist with that too. Always worth trying to call in a favour with grandparents who are usually more than happy to accommodate if they can.
But that's the thing, isn't it? Too many times we see people obsessing over the number. Like, I get sort of really depressed when I hear, we want 50-50 shared care and this kind of stuff. And it's not about the number, is it? It's about just coming up with a practical arrangement. And if it happens to be 45, 55 or whatever, it's so irrelevant. It's just stop thinking about the number. Don't think of childcare and, how your kids spend time with you in terms of numbers, think of it in terms of the quality time and the practicality of those arrangements. That seems to be the key.
Yeah, absolutely. I try and look at the numbers as infrequently as possible. I more prefer to try and get parents to focus on actually what does this agreement look like for us in 6 months' time when we're living it out? What does this look like for, our child? How often are they seeing their parents? What's the real life implications? And then usually when you reach a point where that agreement sounds fair and reasonable to people, when you look at the figures after that, it's not usually that far from equality anyway.
No, and you can always think about it. What would Johnny or Jenny think of this kind of arrangement, can't you? And just try and get parents to think about what their kids would say about the arrangements they're coming up with and whether they would like them. Because just understanding how some of the very practical arrangements that work from an adult perspective may play out to a child can be a really useful way as well, can't it, of looking at things a bit differently.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just thinking then about other tips to keep the cost of divorce low. We've talked about, haven't we, using parenting plans or parenting apps to try and make children arrangements. We've talked about getting into the right emotional space in order to be able to bring your best self to the negotiation table. We've talked a little bit about the fluctuating valuations when you're looking at finances. Are there any other things that can help getting to that financial agreement in a more cost-effective way, do you think, Anthony?
Yeah, so in terms of trying to keep the cost down with the financial aspect of your separation, like we were saying before, if you are able to have a conversation between the two of you around, first of all, identifying the information, making sure that you're both up to speed with that. What is there? What assets do we have? What savings do we have? What liabilities and debts do we have as well? And also looking at your current household expenditure and budget. And again, that can be quite confronting, but it's something that's necessary for both of you to be aware of. If you're able to do as much of that as possible between yourselves, that's going to go a long way in both of you understanding what are our options here? What are some specific areas that we might need to seek some advice on? Because it may be that you need to seek some specific advice and to pay for that advice. But if you're able to work out between the two of you and narrow down to actually what questions do we need to ask and who do we need to ask them from, then that's always going to help. There's lots of resources and information that you can find online that can help you with that. There are budgeting planners and resources. Quite often you can find those for free, which is a really good template to start trying to identify what is the information that we need to be looking at to start with. And there's also lots of other resources, this podcast being one of them, where you can get some initial advice and guidance around what you need to consider before then looking to pin down those details. And that's definitely something that, us or others can support with. If you've got an agreement more or less in principle, but you just need a little bit of assistance in terms of pinning down those final details and getting it formalized, you've saved a big chunk of that process and obviously the cost of that as well.
Well, I like what you say there. I mean, the first thing, as you say, is to make a list of what you've got. I don't think you can underestimate how important that is. And that can take a bit of time, because if you've got to write off, for example, to understand the value of your pension, that can take a few weeks to come through. But doing a spreadsheet of everything you've got is definitely a good starting point, isn't it? So if as a couple, you can share a spreadsheet that says, this is what we've got, these are the value of all our assets, then that goes a long way to both of you understanding what kind of fair might look like. I know, the starting point in any divorce is a 50-50 split, but I think we probably need a big flashing red warning here to say that 50-50 is the starting point, but there are lots of times when 50-50 isn't fair, particularly if there's a parent who's, taken the lion's share of looking after or bringing up children, and then doesn't have perhaps, say, a mortgage capacity similar to the other parent, or doesn't have a pension built up in the way that the other parent may have. So I think there's a lot you can do in terms of collecting information, but getting some advice then on what fair would look like in your specific circumstances. That strikes me as being quite important as well, so that you come to an agreement that the court will be happy to sign off.
Yeah, and that's the difference between equality and equity. I saw something the other day that I thought was a really good illustration of that, which was two kids, a teenager and a young child, trying to see over a fence. Equality is giving them the same size box to stand on, which meant that the teenager could see over the fence, but the child still couldn't. Whereas equity is giving them different size boxes so that they can both see over the fence. And so I think that that's a really, really crucial part of it. And it's why we look at finances and we split them into different categories, noting that it's not as easy as looking at a total figure and splitting it in half. We've got property, which is different to pensions, which are different to your other assets and liabilities like your savings, and then income is also an incredibly important factor as part of that as well. So the combination of those factors, trying to reach an agreement on balance. So yes, note down what you've got, but also identify the differences in the different types of assets that you have as well, and think about how they're going to help you to both be able to look over that fence and meet your needs.
Yeah, you're right. All pounds are not equal, are they? There are some better pounds than other pounds. So yeah, that's really good. I love that analogy. I guess you could take this to extremes and say, well, if I'm going to be really cost conscious when it comes to my divorce, I'm just going to do the divorce and then we'll just agree the finances ourselves and we won't bother, submitting any information to the court. Tell us what the drawbacks of that might be.
Yeah, so the drawbacks of that are that you wouldn't have a clean break. So a clean break is a term that a lot of people are aware of, and it essentially means that you've reached an agreement that's sort of full and final, and that the two of you aren't going to claim against each other in the future. Really important to point out that child maintenance is separate from that, because that's more about your parental responsibility than it is around your marriage. So if you get divorced but you don't get a financial consent order or a financial order that gives you that clean break, you're still financially married in a sense, even if you are legally divorced. It's really important that you get that, because it covers you for any changes in circumstances relating to income or the ability to be able to meet your needs. So it's more for security and protection for both of you individually as well, that you get a clean break order. And the only way to do that is by having a financial agreement that's been approved by the court.
So even if you've managed to agree something yourselves, you should still apply for a consent order once you've got that conditional order in your divorce, so that you can have all of this legalised and finalised. By all means, do some negotiation yourself, but get it properly drafted. And you don't need to go to two separate solicitors to get consent orders drafted. There are drafting services out there like Amicable, where we'll work with you as a couple and a much more affordable price and a fixed price to be able to get your agreement into all the legal documents and to put it before the court. So definitely something to consider. Anthony, it's been absolutely brilliant talking to you and getting your tips and advice on how to keep the cost of divorce low, particularly in this time of cost of living crisis. So I can't thank you enough for joining us. How can people find out more about you and access any help that you have to give them?
Yeah, thanks for having me back on. It's been great to speak with you. You can find me on LinkedIn or on Twitter, Anthony_Syder, and I've got a few blogs on the Amicable website as well. And as you mentioned, I'm a divorce specialist at Amicable, so I can be contacted via our website.
That's brilliant. And if anybody does want any more help or tips or advice on keeping the cost of divorce low, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us at Amicable. We are always happy to help. And of course, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Kate_Daly. And you could hear more about new podcast episodes by following at divorce_podcast. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you'd like to subscribe to more, then please find us on thedivorcepodcast.com on your favorite listening platforms. Thanks very much for joining me, Anthony, and thank you very much for listening.